This is the lecture for week 3 that finishes the Fredriksen book for RLST 006 Jesus. We'll start with chapter 4, which is called Context, the Galilee, Judea, and Jesus. We begin by thinking about archaeology, which can help support the historical evidence or contradict it, for instance. So, when Josephus makes claims in the historical record, we can check it. He says there are certain laws, and the archaeology can find pools and confirm or deny, if there are these pools, then maybe these laws existed about ritual purity and washing, for instance. And of course, our data determines our theories determine our data. So the two go hand in hand and uh, can be either can prove or disprove each other, and sometimes even bias ourselves. So we do have to be careful when we're looking at archaeology what our theories are that um, support or um, possibly confirm these biases. We have evidence and in history, in archaeology, of Samaria as a separate region of Israel, the kind of a northern part of Israel. Um, it was left pretty desolate when Assyria came and carried off the northern kingdom into exile. But Samaria is that area that still, or that was part of the northern kingdom. Then those were the 10 northern tribes of Israel. Then around 700 BCE, they kind of began their own separate kind of existence, independent existence. The Jewish population that remained in Samaria built its own temples, created their own places of worship, and a separate group identity developed, distinct from the Jerusalem Jews, who are the descendants of the two southern tribes of Judah. There are rivalries between Samaria and Judea. And Judea, of course, are the ones, like I said, the two southern tribes that were taken about 150 years later into Babylon. After Israel, the northern kingdom, was taken into Assyria. So there is this kind of tension that exists between Samaritans or Samarians and the Judeans or the Jews. Archaeology also tells us some interesting facts about the Greek language at the time of Jesus. We see that the Jews were adopting the Greek language in their culture and their lives. We can see proof of this Hellenization in architectural remnants that show Greco-Roman designs in architecture, public washrooms, games, theaters. All of these are symbols of Greek culture, not Jewish culture. The baths, right? And we see Greek coins, for instance, as proofs that the traditional languages like Aramaic were slowly diminishing, and the new common language Greek, was taking hold in this period. The cities, the design of these cities, and all have some proof of some Greek influence at the time. There were building projects in the area. Jerusalem, of course, is the biggest city. We have some of the most evidence for. Um, if in Jerusalem, the priests and the aristocratic priests already begin this process years before Jesus, when they're talking to the Seleucids, the successor empire of Alexander, asking for more Hellenization. There's a faction that's encouraging Hellenization. When Herod built the temple, the Hasmonean king, Herod the Great, so-called, the founder of this dynasty, the temple was very Hellenized. It has pillars. It's made out of marble. So Jesus's language is probably Aramaic. The language of most of the peoples there is Aramaic, left over from the Persian Empire. But it's not clear whether he may have learned some Greek. For instance, if he and his father were carpenters involved in these building projects in the Galilean area, it's possible he was working with Greek workmen. His Greek might have been pretty good. So we don't know, of course, the details. Um, if we really thought about Jesus as a Greek figure, one possibility to explain his life be as a philosopher, really, because he's wandering, talking to the poor and common people, encouraging people to change their ideas about life. He would seem to embody some ideas of the ascetic philosophical teacher. There's a cynic school that likes to preach and win converts over to their point of view, and they're quite skeptical, sorry, about certain societal rules and ideas. And Jesus is also similar in some ways to a cynic philosopher. He's living in poverty. He's teaching this kind of countercultural wisdom about not seeking power, not seeking recognition and respect, but standing at some distance from societal norms. But there's a lot of reasons to doubt this, right? To doubt this very Hellenized. Hellenic means Greek, related to this again Greco-Roman culture. The influence of Alexander that uh, bled into, that continued on in the Roman period, because the Romans also adopted Greek cultures, Greek gods, Greek architecture, etc. But was Jesus Hellenized? Well, um, Greek architecture is prominent, but it doesn't mean it's common in everyday life, right? Washington, D.C. also has Greek architecture, but very few people speak Greek in that city. Um, it's if Greek is being increasingly adopted, it's probably the language of the elites, not the common people. And what the common language is, we see is probably still Aramaic. We have even a figure like Josephus, we've mentioned. He's kind of an elite, very well educated Jewish historian who gets uh, very Hellenized, who ends up spending a lot of time with kind of Greek elites. And he admits that his writing is originally in Aramaic, and then he has it translated into Greek by others. So if someone who's as well educated and as Hellenized as Josephus still needs help with his Greek, it's very unlikely Jesus is extremely fluent in Greek or is thinking about himself first in Greek culture, in terms of Greek cultural terms, as a philosopher, again, as a cynic philosopher, following the example of Diogenes and these kind of things. It's very unlikely. Now, the economic situation of the Galilee, again, we have some archaeological evidence. We know it is a countryside, right? Um, but there are some cities or villages now, and that there's some level of wealth. The villages seem to be flourishing pretty well. The soil is rich there. In the cities, we might have up to 16,000, 20,000 people. In the villages, a few hundred. Um, so we don't know exactly, but we do have some sense that these are not like completely impoverished peasants. It's humble, perhaps, not the center of the Jewish world, and certainly not the center of the Roman world, but reasonably prosperous, subsistence farmers. And ruling over Galilee is Archelaus, Herod Archelaus, so one of the sons of Herod. Um, Archelaus, well, actually, sorry, Archelaus is ruling over Judah, but he only does so briefly because after he inherits his father's position, he proves himself kind of unable to carefully administer the troubled land of Judea. So Judea is in the south, Galilee's in the northeast, and Samaria is to the northwest, right? So that's our rough kind of map of Israel. Or this land during Jesus's time. Judah, the heartland of the Jewish people, the big home of the biggest city, Jerusalem, home of the temple. Archelaus inherits it from his father, but because of these riots where he has to send out soldiers and people are being killed, many Jews rose up and asked and protested, and eventually tens of thousands of Jews were killed. So, uh, because of this kind of bloodshed, Rome wasn't as confident leaving the Judea in the hands of Archelaus, and so was starting to take over more and more power. And many Jews actually preferred that. They wanted Rome to rule them directly and not for these Hasmonean kings, because the Hasmoneans were not really very legitimate. Like I pointed out, they were not from the proper priestly family. They were not Zadokites. In fact, they kind of married into the whole Maccabean family, which were actually the winners of the revolt, right? So some Jews just preferred Rome to rule directly. What is the point of having these Hasmoneans as a intermediary, which just draws more taxes, more wealth, right? Um, We know that the Hasmoneans themselves are aware of their maybe contested legitimacy and turn to interesting kind of tricks to hold on to power. So Herod is holding on, for instance, to the robes of the high priests. He knows that these are important in worship. The high priest is supposed to wear them for a number of formal occasions. If he, Herod the king, retains the power over these garments, then they have he has some control over religion and related to religion, the legitimacy of rule over the Jewish people. So it is a contested and complex situation. Hopefully, you can see that there's these successor Hasmonean dynasty client kings of Rome. There is Rome itself, and then there's underneath it all a large kind of base layer of Jews that are very unhappy or concerned about these foreign powers or supposedly Jewish rulers that are make them very unhappy. And at the heart of it all, possibly we could say, maybe if one issue is the hottest issue, it would be tax. And this Roman tax is controversial because they're paying taxes, and it's not related to their religion or their own, innate political desire to pay taxes. It is money that Rome is charging them in order to pay the legions that are keep pacifying them, that are keeping them under control. So it's forcing them to pay heavy taxes so that soldiers and police squads can keep them underfoot and keep them in line. You can see why this would be so controversial, right? To pay money for foreign armies to keep you in line. There is a lot of resentment about paying taxes, and um, this continually every time Jews are paying these taxes is kind of a reminder that they are not free and that foreigners, um, unclean, impure, right, Gentiles, uh, are violating their independence. So eventually, of course, very famously, towards the end of Jesus's life, the governor appointed by Caesar is Pilate. Pilate, there's a number of voices that are quite critical of Pilate we have in history. The Bible actually is relatively positive compared to some of them who have called him abusive, stubborn, kind of pig-headed. He was unlawful and executing people without trial, for instance, sending the troops in with images of Caesar, placing them around the city. These are all acts attributed to Pilate from other sources that we have, and provoking certain kinds of revolts. So um, we also know that Pilate was trying to take money from the temple taxes to pay for an aqueduct for Jerusalem. But the Jews are against this because to them the money is holy money, only meant for the priests, only meant for the temples, whereas Pilate's trying to use it for kind of public works projects. And you can contrast Pilate, for instance, with two other Roman leaders like Vitellius and Claudius, who are a lot more respectful, a lot more careful of Jewish sentiments, basically, and feelings. Rome, in general, in terms of religion, is tolerant. We've talked about this before. They accept other religions. Their ideas in terms of religions are kind of like the more the better. Why not worship more gods? Why not have more patrons, heavenly patrons or divine patrons? And um, that the fact that there are many non-Jews, we've seen these before, the God-fearers, that are receptive of Jewish religion should suggest or demonstrates the broad Roman sensibility of tolerance and even eagerness to worship and new gods and learn new ways of religion. We would call it today. At the same time, Galilee and Judea are having very different experiences politically during this time. Whereas Judea has quite a lot of turmoil. We have Archelaus, we saw, who ruled for a few years, then gets deposed, and then there's a Roman governor. Um, Galilee is pretty calm. Galilee is under the power of another one of Herod's sons, and he basically rules for quite a long time, many years without revolts, and there's not stories of revolutions and unrest in Galilee. A lot in Judea, not so much in Galilee. But even though they have a kind of different, complex, maybe overlapping or separate political order, culturally and religiously, they see themselves as Jews. They're very much connected, unlike the Samaritans, right? So whereas the Samaritans developed their own centers of worship, rivals to Jerusalem, really in some ways kind of like a cousin religion or a sibling religion. But as sometimes you may know, siblings have the greatest rivalries, right? Too close for comfort. Galilee is different. Galilee and Judea, they both recognize one another as Jews, fully participating in the same religion with the same culture. It's just that Galileans are relatively more peaceful, separated from Jerusalem, the big city, and the religious city where all the power and money are flowing. And the Judeans are a lot more tumultuous because that is where Rome's attention is. That's where the Herodian dynasty has this kind of shaky grip on power. Maybe that's where the most serious and intense kind of religious arguments or debates are being practiced. They're united still, Galileans, Judeans, and Jews all over the diaspora are united in their belief in the Torah, which tells them about their dietary laws, right? Keeping of kosher, their temple rituals, the festivals they hold in common, like Yom Kippur or the Passover, and even financially, they're all paying this tax. There is something called the temple tax, which is a huge source of revenue. It's a lot of money flowing in year after year from not only Jews in Galilee and Judea, but from all over the empire. Wherever there are Jews in the Roman Empire, they are paying this temple tax. And we know that it is such a good source of income that the Romans keep it even after they destroy the temple. They keep asking Jews to pay the temple tax and collecting it for themselves even after they've destroyed the temple. So that gives you some sense of the kind of significance of that revenue. Um, and again, to give you some idea of how Galilee, Judea, and Rome might interact, we actually have a history of a tax revolt against Roman taxes. A Galilean is leading the revolt. There's a pilgrimage where Galilean pilgrims are going through Samaria and they're murdered, and as a result, there's an uprising. The Romans kill several Galileans, and we see then, give you some idea of the close relationship between the two. That Galileans might be heading down to Judea and protesting and fighting against Roman rule. Um, even though their own hometown, Galilee, is relatively quiet. They see themselves as being very concerned with events in Jerusalem. Of course, this matters because the hero of our story, Jesus, is a Galilean who dies in Jerusalem, right? We need to remember this, that Jesus is one of these Galileans who's very invested, who his hometown may personally maybe a peaceful kind of peasant farming village, but he's very concerned about what's going on in the big city and all these religious concerns. So Jesus's childhood would have been relatively stable, like we said, in Galilee, safe, well populated. But these Galileans, like Jesus, would have encountered Roman power anytime they went to Jerusalem, especially for the festivals. And any observant Jew would have tried to go to Jerusalem for the festivals. And then they would have seen Roman statues, Roman culture, Roman soldiers, heard Greek and Latin probably. So this is the moment where these kind of worlds collide, Galilee, Rome, Judea. Now, the historical facts that really anchor our investigation into Jesus, the most important or the most kind of the least contested are probably Jesus's crucifixion and John the Baptist's baptism of Jesus. And the reason that scholars of almost every kind, even whether they're Christian or Jewish or atheist, the reason scholars are so convinced that there was a John the Baptist, that Jesus was probably baptized by him, and that Jesus was crucified is that all these things are somewhat embarrassing, we could say, to later Christians. Christians have had the most opportunity and reason to change the historical record if they want to. These are their texts. They exist because they've passed them down. Almost everything we know about Jesus comes from Christian texts. So why would the texts talk about John the Baptist coming before Jesus? Why would they talk about John the Baptist baptizing Jesus? And why would they admit that Jesus was killed on a cross, right, in the way that's reserved for the worst of the worst criminals in the Roman Empire, unless they actually happened, basically? You won't admit to these kind of embarrassing secrets unless you have to, unless it's public knowledge. And so we see John actually, his life parallels Jesus's life in many ways. We have this kind of interesting parallel of John preaching a message of repentance in the face of God's coming kingdom and apocalypse. We have John dying violently, being killed by authorities, right? Political authorities. And their mission is similar, causing people to repent, causing them to turn back to God for the kingdom, to prepare for this apocalypse that's coming. John is kind of getting back to, he's also countercultural in a way, right? His clothing, food, home, living out in the wilderness, wearing camel skins for his clothing, eating locusts and wild honey. All of these things are kind of the cast off, the marginal, away from civilization. And the idea seems to be to keep yourself pure from all the potentially corrupting influence of the money and the urban centers because this kingdom is coming. So there are also some differences, right? They both are. Well, John is baptizing people, and it's claimed that Jesus doesn't baptize people himself directly. Baptism itself, we could think about having a deeper root in Jewish purification rituals. So it could be an extension of that. Um, we also know that John has this. Of course, he's killed according to our records. He's killed by these religious authorities, the Herodians, right? These are Herodian descendants in this Hasmonean dynasty. We don't know if the Romans were involved at all. It could be, as the biblical record suggests, that John's message is offensive because he's calling them out for their immorality, or maybe he's just too popular. And Jesus, though, seems to really esteem John. He's holding John to be more than the standard prophet. And it almost seems to be a kind of mentor-student relationship where John comes first and is teaching or showing the way that Jesus is going to follow. And there are some other, differences we could say, though. There are still some differences. Bodily purity doesn't seem as important for Jesus as it is for John. Jesus is not going exclusively into the wilderness. Uh, John is more ascetic, right, in terms of treating his body more harshly for these religious reasons. Jesus does not seem to be like that. But again, there's a lot of very interesting parallels. You should read the book for these details. Both of them are also directing their message to sinners. So that's kind of interesting that they are not focusing on the religious people, but all people, and especially including the sinners. And there seems to be some tension with religious authorities because of the direction of their message. So we have really this these another kind of interesting parallel is that we have basically John, Jesus, and Paul as the three examples in that time that we have of unmarried Jewish teachers. Jewish rabbis and teachers tend to be married, but we have this kind of apocalyptic trio that seem to be learning and following each other of of examples of Jewish religious authorities that favor celibacy. Jesus does seem to use his authority slightly differently than John too, right? So John waits for people to come to him, whereas Jesus goes to the people and sends his disciples out. Jesus claims his power and his authority based on these healings and exorcisms that he's doing. John doesn't seem to do any miracles, and so anyway, we have these two very fascinating characters, and you could certainly write about them in your essays. Um, One other crucial issue in the study of Jesus is this idea of purity, ritual impurity, moral impurity, which we've already talked about a little bit before, but um, it's important because so the ritual impurity again is contagious, but it is not purposeful and is usually um, kind of contracted by, we can say, by infection, by touching bodily emissions or dead bodies, and is usually cured by some kind of waiting and washing, right? Whereas moral impurity is a choice, a bad choice that's made, what we more think of more commonly as sins. And those usually have to require some sort of repentance and sacrifice, right? So we could say, one frankly, kind of Christian version of Jesus that often circulates is that Jesus is focused on impurity, He purposefully defies these laws of impurity, coming into physical contact with lepers, hemorrhaging women, these kind of things to reform and challenge the purity laws. And he's depending on his mighty acts to spread his gospel and to show that God is no longer concerned about ritual impurity, and contacting people who are impure on purpose to defy the temple and its rules, right? But even though this message of Jesus is somewhat attractive, you have to think that ritual impurity is actually not as exploitative as maybe it seems, right? It's not directed, it's in many ways gender blind. Both men and women are pretty equally affected, right? Because male liquids and female liquids are all uh, considered impure, right? And leprosy can affect, and corpse pollution can affect the rich and the poor. So there's a way that ritual impurity isn't just exploitative or a scam that the priests are running, which keeps people underfoot, keeps people oppressed. And we also need to realize that Jesus is taking part in many of these festivals. The Gospels suggest that Jesus is often going to these festivals and he's purifying himself, is the assumption then, because you have to purify yourself to participate in the offerings and these temple sacrifices and rituals. So there's no indication that Jesus doesn't keep purity, which would have been something that's shocking enough that would have probably caused some mention in these texts that we have, because we do have examples where, for instance, Jesus's disciples get called out for not washing their hands and things like that. So so it's hard to build an entire case around Jesus focused on impurity. Similarly, it's hard to build a case on Jesus only, the Jesus's death, let's say, and Jesus's message is being focused purely on the temple and the cleansing of the temple. This is another traditional interpretation. Maybe Jesus is killed because he overturns those tables in the temple and chases those people out and calls them a den of thieves. The temple always had to use sacrifices and buying and selling to accomplish its purpose. That was kind of the whole point. People cannot bring their own animals and their own pigeons like out from the diaspora, right? You can't travel with your goats all the way from Rome, uh, all the hundreds of miles to Jerusalem. And only unblemished animals can be used anyway, right? If anything happened to the animal, then what would happen? So really, there was this business. It's hard to imagine the temple could work without this kind of monetary transaction of people supplying these animals so people can buy them and have them sacrificed. And so furthermore, the temple is huge. It's really, really big. And so Jesus, overturning money tables at any corner could not have caused a big enough ruckus or commotion to really bring the wrath of the authorities on him. Instead, a better understanding is probably that as he's overturning the temple, he's somehow enacting some kind of prophecy, warning people that the end times are coming, the temple will be destroyed. It's not something they should be too attached to. Um, so, the versions of Jesus that we have often inherited have Jesus as egalitarian, right? Fighting for the common person, compassionate, uh, uh, and anti-nationalist. So, not um, a political zealot, not a patriot that's trying to cause problems, but all of these uh, are understandable from a modern perspective. Many modern Christians like compassion and egalitarianism and want to fight against nationalism. But those messages don't make much sense in Jesus's time itself, right? Being against purity laws was not particularly egalitarian or necessarily compassionate or even anti-nationalist. And if Jesus only focused on things like purity or temple rules, if he's overturning this table, why are people calling him Messiah and why is he crucified, right? These are very political, nationalistic terms. So we still have to take a step back, right? All of these are analyses of what is happening in these final days in Jerusalem and what the context can tell us about, what the clues the context can give us about what is possible or likely to explain Jesus' death. So another thing we can turn to is to analyze the crowds and the false size of Jesus's following. To have a large following is inherently a political act, right? And in the Gospels, sometimes there's these huge crowds. In earlier traditions, we have the number 500 being thrown around, but these large crowds don't seem to have followed him everywhere. It's something that gathers occasionally when he's speaking. And we know that he didn't, repeatedly keep this large crowd or have this kind of large crowd, because that would have been very quickly recognized as political. We have these kind of leaders of revolutions that are drawing off thousands of people with them into the wilderness. That's kind of the standard template for a political revolutionary at this time. They get these thousands of people to follow them, and that's the beginning of the revolution, right? Hopefully, the spark from their perspective, the spark that starts the lights the fire. But Jesus never gets in political trouble while he's in Galilee. All the Gospels and the letters of Paul, all these things all seem to agree that Jesus only gets in trouble when he goes to Jerusalem. So he's not wandering around Galilee with thousands of people, of potentially armed people starting a revolution. And so that's probably again another sign that he isn't recognized as Christ or Messiah while he's in Galilee either, because that is another very political kind of claim that if anyone believes it, will get people to follow you. It's something about Judea, which is much more sensitive, and the Judeans are frequently named as the ones who want to kill him. So something is going on there. When we're thinking about the last days of Jesus, and the different accounts we have, there are reasons to suggest that Mark's account is not that consistent. Again, you can read it. There's certain claims that are made about who Jesus is talking to and what he's claiming to be, that are hard to imagine are historical, right? That the high priests have time to have all these back and forths with Jesus, and that they would want to kill him for the things he says. Um, John's account is actually more plausible, in which he's not accused of blasphemy, and there is the history in John. There's the history of Jesus going up to the temple multiple times, or going up to Judea multiple times before this last um, kind of explosive encounter, and that is very interesting and something we should remember, and we'll come back to in a little bit. Um, so the final days in Jerusalem, right? And we'll move on to chapter 5 here. Uh, if we know that within just a few years of his death, right? Let's keep looking at the historical evidence. That we know that within a few years of Jesus' death, his followers are convinced that Jesus has risen from the dead. They're very excited about it. They say his death and resurrection were kind of his inauguration into his power, and they're convinced he's the Messiah, the Christ, the King. The end times are near. And besides Jerusalem, they're also in Samaria. They're in Judea, throughout Judea, not just the Jerusalem city, but in that whole southern region of Israel, in Galilee, and then they're all abroad in Damascus, Antioch, Joppa. They're beginning to spread all over the Mediterranean. And yet they maintain this relationship with Judea, with Jerusalem. That is the holy city. That's probably their home base, and it's an important place for these early Christians. So um, when Jesus gets to Jerusalem in the last time, there are reasons to suspect that he had already been there before, right? He already had friends in the city. According to John, he's got a house to stay at. And if we believe John's timeline, again, John is unique among these gospels as saying that Jesus went to Jerusalem frequently, actually. It wasn't just this last time. The other gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, make it seem like Jesus basically spent his life in Galilee and only went to Jerusalem at the end. But we have evidence. Josephus talks about Galileans that go to Jerusalem frequently. And even Luke actually hints that Jesus went to Jerusalem at least once as a young boy. And if Jesus really cared for his religion and was a good Jew, he would have been going to these festivals. It's likely he would have gone more than once. So his familiarity with Jerusalem would explain a lot of things, actually. It would explain why the crowds might have a big reaction to him and know him. And it might also explain how the priests were familiar with him and maybe had some insight into his character and his message. We also can see that Jesus' message is tailored to a pretty broad audience. He's not probably only speaking to Galileans, because he's talking about the Ten Commandments. He's talking about the world, Jerusalem as a religious center, the Shema, the central covenant, the central command of Judaism, that God is one and that the people are to love God with all their heart and strength and soul, right? He mentions festivals, these common festivals that are celebrated throughout the Jewish world, even in the diaspora. He's talking about the God of the Jews as kind of a universal God. So Jesus certainly sees himself as part of this larger entity, as part of this larger group. In Mark, even there are hints even in these other gospels that Jesus can identify is the city. He knows what the city is like. In both Mark and Luke, he's condemning the city sometimes. He's saying, "We know what these Jerusalemites are like." All of these things go to suggest that again, Jesus had some familiarity with Jerusalem. And above all, maybe he was already known to Pilate and to these high priests as kind of this Galilean preacher who's come a number of times and has some sort of following. So it could be that on this last visit, Jesus mentioned that he would be crucified, or he hinted. He may have had some sense that things, coming on Passover at the festival of deliverance, right? Passover celebrates the Jews' deliverance from Egypt. He may have had some sense that this is something is different this time. There's kind of a tension in the air, and when he says this, it may have starts to set things in action, right? The crowds are gathering. They're thinking that, something is going to happen this time. Uh, and Pilate's initial response makes some sense then that Jesus is not a trouble. He's not a problem because, again, he knows this Jesus. Jesus has come before and has never caused lasting troubles. He knows Jesus' message. It's not anti-Rome. It's not starting a revolution, right? It is about this kingdom that is meant to be initiated by God. It's a moral kingdom and not a revolution against Caesar type kingdom. Still, if these crowds begin to shout, if they think, as Jesus is hinting, that something is different this time, that the kingdom is coming now, that Jesus is the king, is the Christ, is the Messiah. If those words begin to be thrown around, right? Remember, Messiah, Moshiach or Christ means king, and for the Romans, right, there can be no a king is an alternative source of authority. The only kings they allow are these client kings that are clearly working under Caesar and with the emperor's permission, right, and subservient to the emperor. This would have been considered, if enough people are calling you a king, this would be considered a rebellion. There could be a danger for that at least. That um, we again, on this kind of incendiary matter of the taxes, uh, actually the Gospels suggest that Jesus took a very fine kind of line that he was telling people, for instance, you need to pay your taxes to Caesar because Caesar's image is on them. But the implication, of course, and he even asked this, right? Or whose image are you? And any good Jew would have known human beings are made in God's image. So our money belongs to Caesar, but we ourselves belong to God. So he's, very careful on this very hot button issue, like I suggested about taxes. But if the people are excited, if they think that now's the time for the King, the Christ, to be manifest, and if the crowds get worked up, then it might be enough for Pilate and the religious authorities to be concerned. They may recognize that it is time to, there's the danger that this could spill over, that the crowds being so excited that the kingdom is now, that the king is here, that he's about to reveal himself, may want to make Jesus the king. And Passover, during all these religious feasts, Jerusalem is really kind of throbbing. I mean, it's full of life and energy, and also it's explosive potentially because there are way more people than usual, and these people are in a religious fervor already, right? They're celebrating, like I said, this escape of Egypt, the overthrow of a dominant foreign leader, um, and Jesus's words may have confirmed that, may have caused people to believe that he was going to reveal himself as some sort of a king, and that it was time for the kingdom to be established. If Pilate and the priests know that there's a danger that the crowds could think that Jesus is the king, even though Jesus himself is never preaching that, right? Even though they've known through repeated exposure to Jesus and his message that he's always preaching, um, he's much more careful than that. He's always preaching that this kingdom of God is not to be established through force of arms or political revolution, But people are seeing him as the king. They may well conclude that the easiest thing to do to kind of calm everyone down is to arrest him, just to take him out of the picture, arrest him and kill him, right? Um, this this is really at the heart of this mystery that we've been getting at throughout this book. That a religious figure who's teaching a religious message, as in a non-political message, or purposefully, carefully non-political message, right? Pay your taxes still. I'm not here to overthrow Rome. Is still being killed in a political way, right? But is not being killed with all of his followers. Uh, so the reason is probably that the authorities that are there recognize that Jesus is not actually a threat, that his disciples are not actually a threat. They're not interested in overthrowing the Roman uh, Empire, and again the fact that the church that continues after Jesus' death is not a political threat to Rome, right? Again, reinforces that what these disciples do after Jesus' death. And their claim of his resurrection again proves that unless they grossly misunderstood him, right? That Jesus was never interested in creating an alternative to the Roman Empire, but something more of a parallel, like a religious community that in which the kingdom could be practiced, and that is what happens, right? We know that the early Christians are very enthusiastic, spreading their message, going even to Gentiles, and not at all bothered with the fact that, or seemingly not bothered with the fact that their Messiah, their King, has been crucified, because they claim he's been resurrected, and all these things fit into that apocalyptic paradigm, right? The sign of the apocalypse is that death and resurrection has already begun. Jesus is just the first example of that, and he's initiating this period in which death itself will be overcome, and the fact that the Gentiles are now coming into the church, and that Jerusalem remains the head of their religion, these are all kind of apocalyptic ideas. These are the prophecies of many of the prophets, that everyone will come to Jerusalem to learn holiness, that even the nations, even the foreigners and the non-Jews will recognize the God of Israel, and that death itself will be overcome, right? And these all get woven into the uniquely Christian interpretation of the second coming and the suffering servant, right? So, whereas Jews, there are these prophecies in the Hebrew Bible that speak of a suffering servant, right? Often interpreted as the prophet or Israel itself. Well, Christians will certainly apply this to Jesus, right? So, from a Christian perspective, it becomes clear that all along the servant that should have suffered was the Messiah, was the King. So that instead of the expectation that the Messiah or the Christ is a conquering king, the Messiah is a suffering servant, right? And also the second coming, right, is used again to explain why the kingdoms of the earth have not quite yet, become the kingdom of God, is because in the the first coming was just an initiation. The second coming is the completion, the full um, kind of accomplishment of the messianic data, right? So this is the end of our puzzle, right? If we're going to, as we finish and wrap up this book, we see from the claims of the later Christians, from Paul's letters, from the Gospels, even from the historical data of other non-Christian and sources, pagan and Jewish sources, when we put them all together, along with these kind of concrete facts of people like John the Baptist before Jesus, Paul after Jesus, the crucifixion of Jesus, these claims of resurrection, what we get is this teacher of a coming apocalypse, really, of a coming kingdom of God, and of a new order that is not meant to be accomplished through political revolution, but through a kind of moral repentance, and the creation of a new alternative community in which the values of society, which are oppressive, are overcome, and people are living in a radically different way with these extremely high moral standards, a total financial egalitarianism, a strict sexual ethic, right, of self-discipline, out of love and out of this preparation for the coming kingdom to come. The coming, yeah. So that is the end of our Fredriksen book and our first century Jesus. Now we're going to move into Prothero, our second big question for this class. We're moving from who was Jesus really, right? This is the historical Jesus, into which you can add or subtract as much theology as you want. And now we're going to move into why do we still care, right? If we have this apocalyptic figure, Jewish figure from the first century, why are we still talking about Jesus? And that is our next book, American Jesus.